Good evening, everyone. I was going through old memory lane the other day and looking at this guy. I love bridges, and I wanted to give it another shot in some of the newer tools. This is one I made way back when, and thought I'd try and reproduce this. One of the issues with this guy is that, it always bugged me, is that I think if you walked down this pathway on this little footbridge, assuming you could get up to it with a stepladder or something, is you'd probably whack your head on these cables. And I wanted to kind of adjust for that in a new design. So I thought I'd give this a shot with my own version, which later on I want to try and then turn this into a structural framing element. But for now, just sort of doing the layout geometry and looking at some of the parameters that I can control with this, like raising up and down that arch, moving it back and forth with some of the sliders, but then also doing things like detecting what that sort of range is where you would start whacking your head and looking at, what's the envelope that I can move within that space before I have to bang my head against those cables, and how I can start adjusting the parameters to miss that kind of collision. See where it becomes worse and better, where the threshold is for that kind of design, just by moving the sliders back and forth. So I was going to try and make this from scratch, so let's see how far we get and see how it goes. So I'm going to do a new workspace, and I'm just going to situate myself here. So I'm going to start off by just doing the start and end points of the walkway that I'm going to use. So I'm going to make myself a point by coordinates, and I'll call this whatever I'm going to use for my center point. So let's call that, no, actually I'll start with my start point, which, why not just have it at 0, 0. And I'll do another that's going to be my end point. Let's say it's going to be 100 feet out. So I've got my start and my end point. Where is it out there? There we go. So end point, start point, and we'll get something in between that's going to be the high point of that bridge. So I'll get another one of these guys. I'm just copy pasting that. And the midpoint should probably be at halfway. So I'm going to go x divided by 2. That'll give me my y coordinate for that, and then I'm going to give myself a slider for giving the top of the apex of that curve. So I'm just going to grab myself a double slider, and let's give that a better range. Say maybe it can be somewhere between, it's not going to be flat and it's not going to be huge, so let me say it's 20 to, yeah, why don't we just allow it to be nearly flat. So there, I've got my basic walkway arrangement there, and we'll connect them with the curve. So I'm going to look for a NURB. I want a NURB that's going to go through points. And why are you erroring? Oh, this is a NURB by control points. Is that right? NURB by points. Oh, I'm only giving it 1 point. Stupid me. So I'm going to create a list. And there's my list node. And I'm going to go, got 3 inputs. I got my start, I got my middle, I got my end, and there's my curve. Alright. No craziness here yet. I've just got a basic way to make a span over 100 feet. It's going to be a little parabolic arc. Awesome. Okay. So now we've got the basic thing that I'm going to want to have people walking across. Why don't I give it some thickness? So I'm going to go and I'm going to move this out in 2 directions, to the left and to the right, to give myself a walkway. And that's going to be a geometry action, which is going to be a translation. And I could also just search for that, but I'm going to do translate by direction vector. So I'm going to give it geometry to translate, and I'm going to want to push it in one direction or the other. So this is going to take a vector, and I'm actually going to do this one with a code block node. I'm going to do a vector by coordinates, and I could do this with a node also, but I'm not going to right now. And I want it to offset -4 and 4, and I want it in 2 pieces. That's what that syntax is. I could do this also in a couple of nodes, but this is a bit more concise, or compact, I guess I should say. So that could also be vector, where are my vectors? Vector by coordinates, and I could do -4 and 0. I could do that for one of them, and I could do this for another one of the vectors. But isn't this a little bit more tidy? I think it's a bit more tidy. So I'm going to do that, and then I've got my control center line for my walkway, and then my offsets for my walkway. And let's just make it a surface. So I'll do a surface surface creation by loft. There. So I've got 2 NURBS curves coming out of this guy. So I can just go shabam. Now I've got a surface which spans my area. And I can move this guy around, whatever, make it big and bowed. And depending on what I made my bridge out of, maybe I'd be done. But what fun is that, just to have a big slab of bridge. Alright, so that's that guy. And let's say this is my walkway peak. Just start keeping track of things so that I know what I'm doing. And I'm also going to give it a little swing to one side. Copy paste, and we'll call this walkway swing. I think that's how you spell swing. And I'm going to say this is going to be sort of the sway that this thing can have from, we'll give it a nice big sway for me to play with, over 20 feet. So that's min -10, max 10. And we do that. And what's the result of that? The result of that is now I've got this walkway that I can bend back and forth. Sweet. Alright, so let's make something that will now hold this guy up. And let me just organize this guy a little bit here. So this is my start, middle, end, and I'm just going to get these guys to line up. If I right click, I can align them by the X. We'll align to the left there. Just cue them up a little bit. Neat and tidy. Bring some of these guys in. Alright, so now I want to actually make that whole support structure, this whole thing that it's going to hang off of. And I'm going to do something that I don't like doing very much, but I think it makes sense here. So I'm going to copy paste. I don't like copy pasting because it's, I don't like to reproduce logic, but I think that the upper arc is going to be distinctive enough that it should have its own logic driving it. So let's just make sure that we've got something different here. There, you can see it now. this guy's pulling up. This is going to have probably a whole different range. It's never going to be below 10. Who knows? Maybe it'll go up as high as 100. I doubt it. So this is going to be the sort of the support spine for this bridge. Whoop, there we go. Nice and big. And this one will similarly be able to swing back and forth, right? We'll leave it about where it is for right now. And what happens next? Let's see. So we've got the support. We've got the central surface that it's supporting. And so now I want to get some outriggers. Basically, if I just send my cables straight down to the edges of my walkway, people are going to bump their heads into it no matter what. So if we look at this guy for a second, my model, it's got outriggers that come out to give people some clearance. So what I want to do is I want to make a secondary set of cables that go over to one side. So let's do that. So that's going to be taking this same piece of geometry here, which here I've translated by -4, say a nice 8-foot wide walkway. So now I'm going to want to have some variable outrigger system. I haven't really figured out how far out that's going to be. So let's take two of these nodes. Let's take these two guys right here. And I could just go in here and change this so that it's an outrigger out on the sides like that. But let's give it a variable so that I can play with that a little bit. -A and A, which will just be A. And I'll get myself another slider to feed into that. Like that. And this is going to be bigger. I'm not going to do it any less than 1. I probably won't do it any less than 4. And I don't know, let's be crazy, see how big we can make it. So now I can give myself my little outriggers there on the side. And that's basically going to be, you know, again, that's this set of supports right here, which also define these support struts. All right, so now I've got the basic framework here, or layout geometry. I've got where I'm going to walk, the main support for it, and the connection points. Well, I've got the connection lines, but what I need is actually the connection points for where these things are all going to be connecting. So let's put some points on these guys. So I want to get some points at a parameter. So it's a quality of a curve. This is always kind of interesting to me. Is like if you go to look to put points on these curves, we kind of had to make a decision in putting together the geometry. You know, is a point that occurs on a curve a property of a curve, or is it a point that is assigned to a certain curve parameter? It is a quality of a curve. That is, it's an action that you do to a curve. So if I do point at parameter, if I just pass it these guys, you can see that automatically, because if you float over this thing, you can see what the default parameters are, and you can see that the parameter default is 0. And that little float out. So this guy right here is saying 0. Give me a point at the 0th of these two curves. You can see those two guys right there. So I do not want simply a point there. I would like points all along here, right? So I can give myself some numbers. I could do this stuff by giving myself a range. Is it a range or is it a sequence? I never remember this. Start, end, step. Yeah, so I could go start at 0, end at 1, and give me a step size of 2, like that. And that would give me a whole sequence of numbers. Actually, no, it wouldn't. It would give me only one number. So there. Now I've got a whole bunch of numbers within a parameter range of 0 to 1. And I could do that, and that would be cool enough. I would need to actually set the lacing so that if you look at the lacing here right now, it's matching the numbers that are coming out of here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, with these two curves. But right now it's only giving me the shortest. So 0 is happening on the first curve, and point 1 is happening on the second curve, and then it's calling it a day. And I wanted to actually do something much more thorough. That is, I wanted to do all of these numbers on all of these curves, all of these parameters on all of these curves. And so that's the lacing. So the lacing for this is going to be cross, which is do all of these things to all of these things. And then, bam, I get all of those parameterized points all the way along this curve. That's cool. But I could actually do this in a little bit of an easier way, again, with just some range syntax. So I'm going to double click in here, and I'm going to say, I want to start at 0, and I want to go to 1. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see it. And I want to do it 10 times. So start, end, increment. And what that's going to give me is 0 to 1 in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 10 because it starts at 0. So I could just make these nicer, rounder increments by doing that. Or wait, is it 11? I can never remember how these things index. There we go. 11 goes from 0 to 10. And will give me nice round increments. Why don't we do that? And so there, same, but you know, again, it's just looks a little nicer, and it's a little easier to manipulate. So I'm going to stick with my code block. All right, so now I've got all of my points along this curve, shabam. Now I also want to do that up here on this top of the arc, right? So that top of the arc is up here. See that guy? So let's put these guys a little bit closer to each other so I can have them speaking to each other a little bit. So I'm going to want to do the same thing. I'm going to want to do another curve by points at parameter, but I'm just going to want to use a different curve. There. So now I've got my connection points to do my cables to connect from these guys to these guys. So let's make some lines. Just look for a line, and the first thing that comes up is by start point, end point, and that's exactly what I want. Now I have another little sort of matching problem here, because I've got, on one hand, I've got a list of points, see that, along one curve, and I've got a list of lists. A list of what? A list of lists. So list 1, or list 0, sorry, are all the points that go along one of these curves. And list 1 is the points that go along the other curve. So what I want to do here is I want to match these points to each one of these points, right? Now this is where we get into some interesting tools to start matching things to each other. And one of the tools that I'm going to get out here is called a map. And this in particular is called a list map. What a list map does is, you can see the note here, it says applies a function over all elements of a list, generating, whoops, I lost my tooltip, generating a new list from the results. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say I've got a list that's coming in, which is in fact a list of lists. I have a list that has a bunch of points on it. Now I want to do something to every item on that list. That's what map does. Map says, do this thing to all the things on this list. Well, I want to make lines to all the things on that list. And that line is going to involve, every time I make it, is going to involve this list. And so it's a little bit magical, and it's sometimes a little hard to explain what's going on here. But basically what it's doing is it's saying, I want to apply this function to everything here and everything on every one of the lists in here. So it allows me to make some reasonably complex sort of geometry and decisions. It ends up coming out looking pretty simple, but the result is, well, the result is what I want, and that's what counts. So here are all my lines. And so now I can go back and I can flex this thing and see how I'm doing, because I'm getting pretty close to my original intention here of making this bridge. Oh, well, one thing that's wrong is that I've got cables that are going along the ground, which, well, if nothing else, is a tripping hazard. So let's get rid of that. So right now, my parameterized points start at 0 and end at 1. I could just scooch all these guys in by just saying I want my series to start not at the 0 parameter, but you know, indented in, straightened out. All right, so anyway, now we've got all those guys. We should have our struts that go across too, right? Because right now this slab of walkway is just floating out in the middle of the ether. So we can still use some points that we already have. So right now I've got all the points that go along these two lines, right? So I want to connect them all the way across. So I'm going to break this out into two lists. I'm going to go, what do I want to use? I'm going to use deconstruct. And this is a list manipulation tool, which is going to take my list and it's going to break it into the first item on a list. Let me jiggle the handle again here. Curve point at parameter. So now I've got, I'll do a watch node on here just to show you what's going on here. So I've got watch node here that has got my first list of points and then my second list of points. But this is actually getting the first item on the list and then everything else in the list. So this is actually a nested list. And I want to flatten that out so that these two things have the same list structure. So I can go flatten. And now what this is going to give me are two similarly structured lists, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did before with, I'm going to get a line by start point, end point. And instead of doing funny mapping operations on it, I'm just going to do a pretty straightforward end point and start point. Let's try that. There we go. So there we are. Now I've got all the basic bones of my bridge, and now I can sort of start massaging this into place to look like the structure that I had from the model from the images before. So what do? We can lower down one of these peaks. It looks a little tall, and let's see, how's that? And let's give it a little bend to it. So this is my, I'm just going to rename this. This is my support swing. Surely somebody could come up with better names for these things, but that's not what I'm doing here. Not support swing, this is the support azimuth, or support peak. This is my support swing. Alright, and now we'll just sort of get this guy moving out a little bit. And actually, let's make it more than that. That is not bold. Let's give it something really wacky. There we go. Alright, so we've got that thing that's bending out, and we're going to manipulate the walkway so that it's bending out. Which direction is it going to go in? Oh, you know what? I didn't move this whole thing over. The start point and end point shouldn't be right there in the middle, right? Those should be moved over. So let's do that. Let's give this whole thing an offset. And that's going to be in the X direction on each one of these guys. So let's see. If I do, let's just call it 5 feet. I can move both of these guys out 5. And actually I'm going to do these on a slider. Alright, there he is. So you can see now I've got my arc here for my support offset a little bit from my walkway. Right? So let's get the support swinging out over the walkway, which is going to be swinging in the other direction, like that. And then let's get the walkway swinging in the other direction. Alright, so we're closing in. And I'm actually going to move this guy a little bit further out because it still looks like my arc is coming down in the middle of my walkway. So let's push it way out. Is that? Yep, there we go. Pushing that guy out. Now the final thing I want to sort of check out here is looking at if I have clearance for my walkway. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little extrusion from that slab of surface. That's this guy right here. I'm just going to move all of this down a little bit. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to thicken the slab to like an 8-foot slab to just make sure that I've got headroom. So for that I can look for my thicken, which is, I've got a couple of options. I can thicken both sides, or I can just thicken one side. And I really just want to do one side. So if I do my surface, anyway, so what I'm doing is I'm making a surface thicken that has a certain parameter to it. I've got 11. It probably makes more sense to have something a little shallower, maybe like, oh, there we go. I just wasn't running automatically. There we go. All right. So now I've got an 8-foot slab offset here, right? And I can see whether or not people are going to whack their heads on this guy. So I can go and I can inspect. I can see that I've got intersections happening here. I can take appropriate action to fix it by either saying, well, I'm going to say that my walkway peak is going to be lower, which isn't going to help me too much. The swing can be different. Let's see if I straighten it out some like that. I'll be clearing that intersection. And what other parameters have I got? I can also change how my arch is set up. So I can give it a bigger offset like that, which is actually going to make it worse. Anyway, you get the idea. I can start monkeying around with this and look at where my intersection points are. I can actually even put on an intersection node to detect whether or not I have collisions between these lines. I will leave it at that for today because this has already run long. But the next steps on this are going to be to assign Revit structural framing to these different members, and probably some adaptive components to create the plank that would go along the whole edge. Anyway, hope that that was fun for you. It was fun for me. Sorry for the refresh problems. We'll be working on it.